This episode is brought to you by Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. The Grateful Dead and Dogfish Head have gotten the band back together with the release of Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale, a light-bodied pale ale brewed with sustainable kernels of grains, granola, and heaps of good karma for a refreshing brew that's music to your taste buds. Available nationwide, visit dogfish.com to find Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale in your neck of the woods. Dogfish Head Craft Brewery is located in Milton, Delaware. Please drink responsibly.
We see you getting after your fitness goals. But what about those money goals? You can count on Credit Karma for a clear view of your finances and your progress, helping you see results so you can keep checking off those financial personal bests and find your way to money. Progress never felt so good. Intuit Credit Karma. Karma you can count on. Download the app today.
Hello, and welcome to episode 261 of Something About the Beatles. And this is a pretty special one in my mind because it features some of my favorite guests on the show all together at once. First is Jerry Hammack, who you may know from his series of 5 volumes, the Beatles Recording Reference Manual series, taking you inside the studio for the recording of all their works from 1962 onward. Great stuff, some new scholarship there for the people that might have started exploration of the Beatles' studio work with the Lewison book and the recording sessions back in 1988. This takes it much further, and it is continually updated as new information becomes available. Jerry's got a new book out now that he is currently promoting, Home Studio Recording: The Complete Guide. It's a collaboration with Warren Huart. I think I'm saying his name right. And basically, it's a way of putting everything he knows in his profession as a producer, musician, engineer, tech head, all that stuff, and putting it in the hands of anybody who's a musician out there or wanting to otherwise set up a home studio. Basically, goes into great detail in demystifying and making reachable how to get the sound of those great records we love from the 60s and 70s, that warmth and that dimension, the great sounds that we're used to as Beatle fans from EMI and George Martin, as well as Elton John and other artists, that sort of thing. It enables you to use current technology to achieve those aims. For anybody that's so inclined, I highly recommend it. So Jerry is serving as sort of co-host, interviewer with me on this show. I gave him the lead because our guest is somebody we first brought onto the show back in maybe 2020, I guess it was. He came on to discuss the Plastic Ono Band albums, the debut John Lennon and Yoko Ono 1970 releases, which were among the first works he did as a young tape op hired earlier that year at EMI. I'm speaking, of course, of producer John Leckie, one of my favorite guests and favorite persons in the world to talk to, because he is so full of great stories. He witnessed so much history on stuff that we find very important as fans of all this terrific music. Now, he started as a tape op in February 1970 at EMI. He didn't work with the 4 Beatles as a collective, but he absolutely did individually. I guess early on, one of his assignments was he worked on Sentimental Journey album with Ringo, and then subsequently on the McCartney debut, definitely as part of the chain, he was there for that. And later on, he worked with Paul and Wings on Red Rose Speedway, as well as the Hi Sea Moon single, which he will talk about in this show, actually. But his first 2 big projects were All Things Must Pass, and it can't possibly get any bigger than that as far as a major undertaking, both with the scope of the finished release as well as the cast of characters involved, ranging from George through Phil Spector, through all the supporting musicians, Clapton, and members of the future Derek and the Dominoes, who, by the way, he also worked with for the Layla album. And, just odd sort of guests that came along, Peter Frampton and Phil Collins and Gary Brooker and Gary Wright. You'll hear him talk about all that and the whole process of making that album. That's our main focus today, as when the show is being released, it is the 53rd anniversary of the start of the All Things Must Pass sessions. From there, he worked on the Plastic Ono Band albums, but he also, for Apple, worked on the Lon and Derek Van Eaton album, sort of a George Harrison-esque side project for him that really Klaus had a hands-on role on as producer. And we talk about that a little bit. Derek and the Dominos, as a producer, he's best known for his work with artists ranging from Roy Harper, whom he did, I think, most every album, or certainly most of them, as well as XTC, their first several albums, Stone Roses, Radiohead, Simple Minds, on and on down the line. He worked with Pink Floyd along the way. Tremendous body of work. Bill Nelson and Bebop Deluxe. Ian McNabb, who's been on the show before. Roger McGuff, formerly of Scaffold, with Mike McGear, also as seen in the Ruddles TV special. So, an unbelievably stellar career. And as I said, he is such a great interviewee. And you see a lot of his stuff. If you just Google John Leckie and interview, you'll find him holding forth on any number of artists and albums that he worked on. So just an amazing career and a great guy to talk to. Originally scheduled for part of the show was returning guest, friend of the show, friend of mine, Luther Russell, who got his start as a member of the Boot Heels and then Freewheelers, solo artist, currently new release, his collaboration with Jody Stevens from Big Star as Those Pretty Wrongs. As this show is being released, this end of May, early June 2023, he can be seen on the road with Sarah Beth Tusek, whom he co-produced her latest release, Joan of All, that just came out this month. And they're on the road in Britain right now. I know they've got a date in London coming up, but if you're hearing this and you're curious, want to meet Luther, go check it out. And Sarah Beth's album is terrific, Joan of All, and you can look that up as well. Sarah Beth Tusek, Tucek. So Jerry's got a new book out. John's got an amazing career. Luther, who essentially makes a cameo in this show, is out there on the road in Britain right now and will be doing some live dates later this year in the States. Mostly, we're celebrating All Things Must Pass and getting an inside view on the making of that, stuff you won't hear or see anywhere else. This conversation was taped in 2021 as part of the Fab 4 Con Jam special weekend, and I was thrilled to talk to John then, and we've had him on the show since, and I probably will again because I just enjoy talking to the guy. It was a fun conversation to have, and hope you enjoy it. Here we go.
John, really excited to have this conversation with you today. Just before we started rolling, I fanboyed out on you. I'm not going to restrict myself from going back to that place in my heart to fanboy on you. So when it comes to All Things Must Pass, which was, I believe, at EMI, you were the tape op to the entire project. And one of your first big projects at EMI as a tape operator. What was your observation of the studio experience that was fostered by Phil Spector in leading the sessions?
I started at Abbey Road in February 15th, 1970, and I think these sessions started in May, I think it was end of May, yes, the first sessions. And I'd already tape-opped, actually, on some sessions with Paul McCartney on the first album, with John Kurlander engineering, and also on Ringo sessions, Sentimental Journey, with, I don't know who, it's probably Peter Baum. So there was an engineer there called Peter Baum, who'd done Pink Floyd. He'd been there for years, you know. He was really old. He was about 40 or 38 or something. But to me, he was real old, you know. But he was lovely, and he taught me a little. It's not just he taught me things, but he allowed me to do things. You know, he said, "Oh, you can do this," or something, or "You take over." Or, "I'm going to make a phone call," and he'd come back an hour later or something, and I'd be terrified, you know. So I kind of learnt a lot quickly. And then this big All Things Must Pass sessions came up, and I think I'd worked with Phil McDonald on some Roy Harper sessions. I don't know if you know Roy Harper, but hats off. That's it, yeah. And Phil had done these sessions, and I think I'd tape up with Phil before, and they were lengthy sessions. Most sessions at Abbey Road were in the morning, 10 till 1, 2:30 to 5:30, and then 7 till 10, and most sessions finished at 10, most sessions finished at 5:30 in the afternoon, you know. But these sessions, people would wander in about 4 o'clock. No one would really be there before 4 in the afternoon. And very often they would go on till 4, 6, 8, 10 o'clock in the morning, so they were real lengthy things with endless playbacks, endless takes, working all the time. But it was very exciting, of course, because there was lots of people there, lots of musicians all looking to play.
So it's interesting you brought up the endless takes. Harrison has a reputation through the White Album period of like recording the most takes ever on a Beatles track. I think on Not Guilty, it was like 102 takes or something like that. Was that par for the course when they were working on All Things Must Pass, when they were trying to nail the backing track for this? I think you've also mentioned in previous interviews that this was a group effort, much in the way that Spector would run other sessions where it was the entire band in the room doing it. Did they go through a lot of takes to establish the backing tracks for these?
I seem to remember, there were a lot of takes. I'm sure Robert would know how many different takes were used, but the way Phil Spector would work would be, with the musicians in the room, and he would be in the control room, and he would talk to them through the talkback and kind of ask for different sections, like the drums and the guitars. And should we just go through who was there, the musicians that were there? Because I can always remember, because to me, I thought this was fantastic. And I thought all sessions were like this. And of course, when you go back to just 4 guys playing, it's a bit boring after all this. And of course, this is before Derek and the Dominoes. I mean, to me, there was, you could say, the English contingent and the American contingent. So, of course, there was Ringo and Klaus Voormann. Klaus was the bass player, and Klaus was a wonderful person. Instantly, I warmed to him. Instantly, he would talk to me. I'm the tape op sitting at the back by the tape machine. And
right.
The only time people would come in and talk to me is if they wanted a cigarette. Have you got any cigarettes? Give me a cigarette or something, But no, Klaus was lovely, and Ringo as well. And maybe, I don't know, if Ringo recognised me from some of these other sessions, but there was Klaus and Ringo, George and Phil Spector. And I think those 3 were there with Phil Spector on the first day. And George recorded all the songs, and it was very much, okay, what have you got? And they would go through, and probably 1 take for each song just to get a rough idea. And I remember actually, because I kept thinking there was one other person who's credited, which is John Barham, who was the arranger. And he was there at those early demo sessions, writing notes, scores,
Oh, interesting.
He was great. And he would talk to me and go, I don't know what I'm doing there. What am I doing here? There's all these people. There's all these famous rock stars. And what am I doing here? George asked me to come along to make sure it was good and everything. And I guess he scored the strings and things as well. But he played the harmonium on My Sweet Lord, I remember. And a lot of the harmonium and checking out parts and chords, he would go around with his score. And no one else, of course, had the music. He didn't give anyone music to play to. He might have written chord charts out for Badfinger or something, given it to them. So as far as I remember, this first day, I think, was just running through all the songs, and they were recorded. Were they recorded on the 8-track or straight on the stereo? I'm not quite certain. But it seemed like the next day we were in, and suddenly the room was full of people. There was 2 drummers. There was Jim Gordon and Ringo. Carl Radle, who was the bass player, American, so there was 2 bass players. There was Gary Wright, who I didn't really know, playing the piano. And one of the most forward characters I remember is Bobby Whitlock. Bobby Whitlock was always there for the playback. He was always sitting at the mixer. He was very constructive in what he had to say. And he was very much a sort of musician that would get the other musicians he'd say, hey, you should be playing the F on the bass or something. He was quite a good character. And Eric Clapton, of course. And, I'd been following Eric Clapton since the Yardbirds, since John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Eric, to me, was God,
Were you responsible for the graffiti then?
Yeah, it was me. Yeah. And I tell you something else I tell people, which is, I should be ashamed, really, is I was 20 years old in 1970. And at that time, I don't want to say this, but the Beatles weren't hip, really. I mean, they weren't, to a 20-year-old living in Portobello Road in Notting Hill Gate in a hippie house,
Mm-hmm.
smoking dope every night, just like long hair and jeans and whatever. The Beatles weren't hip. They were a bit like a One Direction, take that kind of teeny bop band, really. I mean, they were like Hard Day's Night. And by the 70s, the Beatles weren't the hippest band on the planet by any means. So, I mean, what was hip was, to us anyway, was Captain Beefheart, Frank Zappa, a lot of the American bands, The Doors. We were always into authentic blues and soul and Otis and all those kind of things. And the avant-garde and Stockhausen and the electronic music and all sorts of what you could say weird stuff. And, I mean, we were more into John and Yoko. We were more into Yoko than John, really. But that was just me, where I was in London in my headspace. So I wasn't particularly fazed about working with the Beatles. I was a little bit scared, but I wasn't enamored by them. I wasn't like, oh God, what are they going to do next kind of thing. So
but it was different working with them individually, I would suppose, because it wasn't going to be the same format.
That's right. And because the room was full of Americans, and proper musicians playing, and there was so much going on all the time, it was a whole different thing.
So you talked about the playback and the constructive criticism that would come on playback. Spector is known for sculpting the entire sound of a recording for the recording, including reverb, including any sort of ambient effects that he wants to have on it. Getting that through the setup of the band, getting it through the miking, coming to the sound all together. Was there a lot of that kind of adjustment going on in the early days of the sessions to kind of figure out how this band worked in the studio, how we should place them, any of those kinds of things happening?
All the time. That's exactly what was going on, really. That's exactly why there were so many takes. And it was being molded in the control room with reverb and tape echoes running. In those days, we didn't have digital or anything. So to create a delay, we'd have a tape machine running on a very speed, and you could make it space echo kind of thing. In Abbey Road, there were 3 echo chambers, which each had their own different character, their echo plates. So even when the recording was happening, there was reverb, and particularly tape echoes were used, which is often difficult because sometimes people want to hear it in the headphones. And, when you've got a basic setup, that can often be difficult because the only thing that really matters is what's coming out the speakers in the control room.
In the end.
The end. And very often the musicians would come in and be quite shocked as to what we were listening to because they were listening to something very dry in the headphones. All sorts of other little things that I learned at that time and I still use as a producer is nowadays, of course, mixers and the whole routing is very sophisticated. And there's a big thing about musicians make their own headphone mix. You have to give the musicians all the components and they will mix it as they want. And of course, this doesn't work because they're not playing together. They're all playing to what they want to hear and their instruments up loud and everything else is very often the bass is up loud and the bass drum is turned right down. Things like that. But in those days, everyone got the same headphone balance. That was it. It was maybe the singer would have his voice up a little bit, but everyone was listening to the same thing. So yes, there was all these musicians in the room. I've never really counted them, probably 12, 14 musicians, as well as 2 drummers, 2 bass players, 2 piano players. It was Gary Brooker. Bobby Whitlock would often play the Hammond. It wasn't a C3 Hammond. It was a smaller one. I can't quite remember what the make of it is. And there was this harmonium, which was used extensively, which, as you can hear on the record. And there was Badfinger. And the great thing about Badfinger is they were the same age as me. So I'm 20. Everyone else are like really old, about 25. Everyone else are 26. The Beatles and stuff. They're all like 5 years older than me, but Badfinger were 20 and we got on immediately as mates. And George would just want them in the corner with acoustic guitars around one microphone, strumming the chords. And they were great, happy to be there. And of course, there was another thing was that Bobby Keys and Jim Price were in the back room and their parts were laid down live at the same time as the backing track. There was no overdubs from them. They always went down live, and those parts, maybe with John Barham, he'd worked out the horn part, and Phil Spector as well. There was time spent where the whole band was sitting there while they were working out the horn parts, you know. And of course, Bobby Keys, the character, you know, he's a big guy and he comes in with blowing his sax during the playback, you know, in the control room. So, you know, he was great. Who else was there? Different people would pop in, really.
Alan White?
I don't remember Alan White. But then again, I'm really stupid. I don't remember Dave Mason, you know. Right. But he did loads there, but maybe he never came in the control room. The other thing that's interesting about Studio 3, that's a hang-up about Studio 3, is to get from the studio to the control room, you had to go outside. There wasn't a door. You had to leave the studio. It was on the same level. You had to leave the studio, walk down the corridor, go through reception, which involved looking out into the car park, the girls out there, Apple Scruff's out there in the car park, and then going into the control room. So it was a bit of a trip to go from the studio to the control room. So very often they would spend all day in the studio playing, and very rarely... people like Dave Mason, maybe he didn't come in the control room for a playback or anything.
You've talked about your reluctance now in your career as a producer to pass off tracks that you've worked on to like a mixer in some other place, someone who hasn't been involved in the music from the start, or hasn't been in the pre-production, hasn't suffered with the musicians as they've developed their vision in that. And so obviously can't be in the headspace of the band or the producer in creating it. Is that something you took from Spector, the fact that the production got baked into the tracks, that, you know, anyone getting their hands on Spector tracks, you get what you get, and, you know, it's faders up and you've got a Spector mix. Is that something that you took from those sessions?
Probably, yeah. Yeah, I still believe that the magic happens with the more people playing together in the room. I mean, the most boring and the most sterile thing is doing the drummer to a click track, or someone strumming the chords to a click track and doing a rough vocal and building it up. I mean, that's so tedious, and, you know, you're always searching for magic, whereas you put 4-6 people in the room together, you know, you do things like, if you want strings, have them there with the back. And I'm a great one for, of course, for the vocal going down with the backing track. You know, I always believed that the vocal is the click track. We never had click tracks in those days. No one played to a metronome or a click. To me, the obvious thing, the vocal determines the tempo of the song. And so you go for a good vocal on that backing track. And there's other things like the guitar tuner, of course, because when you hear any record before before mid-70s, before guitar tuners were invented, everything's tuned to the piano. So people would come in and tune their guitar to whatever the piano tuner had tuned the piano to, you know?
Right.
And then when you do an overdub, you do your solo, you tune to the track what you're listening to. So the whole thing has got a certain resonance that is to do with the tuning, or the slightly out of tuningness, you know, about things. A lot of people kind of go, oh, Rolling Stones are so out of tune, I can't listen to them. But it's like, whoa, hang on. And of course, the Beatles are much more in tune, because maybe they had George Martin's ear there to keep that in check.
How did you carry that forward in your career then? You're starting with these really organic production experiences and really natural experiences where it's the relationship between the musicians, it's them working together and sorting it out together. How did you carry it forward in your career where things got more and more exacting and the expectations of finish became more and more exacting? Did that really run counter to you, or?
It did, yes. I still believe in the magic of, I'm not really a musician. I've never played on stage. I've never played in a band or anything. So when I stand in front of a musician that's playing, you know, it's magic to me. It's real magician stuff. I'm still bowled over by hearing a great performance, you know, and through the years, I recognize a great performance. You know, sometimes people say, well, what is a producer? He's the guy that chooses what take to use. When the music stops, he's the guy that's the first person to say something. Because very often when a band do a take, they come to the end and it goes quiet and they all look at each other. And the first person to speak, he's paid to speak at that moment, you know, it's the producer, you know. So that's kind of what I learned, is how to respond and how to communicate, respond to musicians, and respond to their ego. Because all musicians, performers have a certain ego, even though they work hard not to have, but they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't have an ego,
No, got to have an ego to be in the music industry.
And sometimes you have to bolster that up and give it support, and sometimes you have to dampen it down.
With all these egos in the room, did it present any problems? Because the way I envision it is everybody is there because they love George and they're friends of his and he'd played with them before. So I would imagine in that sense, maybe it was an atypical session where you've got many established brands together in the same room.
Yeah, George was the man. I mean, they all loved George, and whatever George did, they focused on him and they were all trying to do their best for him. There was a lot of love in the room, really. I mean, there was no bad vibes. All this stuff about Spector having a gun and being drunk and stuff, just not true. I never once saw Spector with a drink. Certainly I didn't see any guns. There was stuff going on out in the studio, but not in the control room. And Phil Spector was very much in control of the situation all the time, really. Nothing happened without his order, really. There was no arguing as such.
I'm curious, on the relationship side, how was Spector in managing the relationships of all these great musicians and getting them to work toward his and Harrison's vision for the track? How did he manage those relationships and those egos?
Well, he's a producer. That's what he does. That's what they're paying him for. I mean, that's what he does. He managed all those egos.
But not a bully.
If they were playing shit, he would tell them straight away. He would stop. He would say, hey, organ, whatever on the organ, is that what you played on the last take? And they go, no, man, I just changed it a bit. And they say, well, don't, get out. We'll get someone else in or something, And
wow.
So he was very strict about what was being played. And even though we might be on take 27, you still got to play the same thing. Don't improvise, don't embellish, don't change what you're doing.
So with each take, because essentially the tracks that you're moving ahead with are these big finished backing tracks with very little embellishment. I'm picturing then that with each take, you're getting closer and closer and closer to what the vision of the song is. And if I've decided now this is my vision for the guitar part, then don't ever change that guitar part. And if this is my vision for the progression of the drums through it, then don't change your lick. I want to fill there every time.
That's right.
That sort of thing.
That's exactly that. Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah,
really interesting working process.
Yeah.
It's interesting because there's an anecdote floating around that earlier that year, and I don't know if this was before or after your start date, when Spector was brought in to supervise the finishing of the Let It Be album, that he was supervising orchestras and other session musicians that weren't Beatles brought in for this project. And things had gotten so heated with his manner and his browbeating that Ringo had to intercede and say, listen, Phil, that's not how we do things here at EMI.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. I mean, Phil Spector was in control of the sessions, of all the time and the music that came out. And working rhythms and things like, for instance, My Sweet Lord with Badfinger, jang, gang, jang, the cross rhythms that are going on there. I can remember them spending a lot of time working those out. Then, when you've got that, you put tape echo, you put delay on all the acoustic guitars, so the whole thing shuffles in the delay, I'd be sitting at the back thinking, what's going on here? This sounds a mess. And then suddenly it would all lock together and become one guitar. What was 5 acoustic guitars with tape echo on became one big guitar, and suddenly you sit up and go, wow, that's how it works. That's what they're doing. Even now, I work towards those kind of things where you recognize magic, you imagine that's something happening.
That's really interesting that it's not apparent in the moment, but clearly he has the experience and the vision to know when I do this, this is what it's going to come out like. Trust me.
That's true, yeah. There was a lot of fun. I mean, very often people would come in for a playback and Phil would start talking, like telling some story about Lenny Bruce or Ike Turner or something. Yeah. And of course, the whole room you'd sit down for an hour and Phil would just tell you all about Ike Turner and whatever. See, I can't remember any specific stories, but he told a lot about Lenny Bruce, because I think Lenny Bruce died in Phil Spector's house. So he was a big friend of Lenny Bruce at this time. And George, of course, was in the back chanting Hare Krishna all the time. George often, you'd hear him in the corner going, Hare Krishna, Krishna, you'd hear his muttering Krishna, Krishna all the time. Just calm down, keeping it cool,
Robert pointed us both to this memo that Spector produced in, I think, August of 1970, back to Harrison. So basically production notes saying, we're closing in on the end of these sessions. We're moving toward the mix where there's some things to finalize. He talked about the addition of orchestrations coming up. And he also talked a lot about the importance of the vocal performances, as well as the fact that where this album would really come together would be in the mix. Were you there as a tape op in the mixing session?
No, let me explain. I was at Abbey Road, so that was 8-track. At the time, Abbey Road had 8-track. It was a 3M 1-inch 8-track machine. So all these recordings, the 8 tracks were filled up. In fact, the 8 tracks weren't filled up. Very often, the whole band was put down on 6 tracks because you had to leave 2 tracks for the vocal and the backing vocals.
Right.
So even though it's 8-track, you'd never fill up all 8 tracks. Otherwise, you're stuck. You can't put anything else on, And then Trident was 16-track, which is the reason that George went there and did all the voices on My Sweet Lord, all the string parts on All Things Must Pass, and
Isn't It a Pity?
Whatever else has strings on. Isn't It a Pity? Yeah. The string part. So I wasn't there for that because, of course, once you're 16-track, you've got a mix on 16-track. He couldn't come back to Abbey Road. So I was there through recording all the tracks with Phil McDonald, everything that went down on 8-track.
That final work to finish, to port from 8 to 16, to do the additional overdubs and things.
Yeah.
And also I recall through my other Beatles research that if you're an EMI guy, you don't get to work at Trident.
No, that's true. That is true, yeah. Yeah, an EMI guy, you can only... And then similarly, a Trident guy couldn't work at EMI. The only people that were allowed to work at EMI was Jeff Emmerich. I didn't even know Ken Scott. I didn't know who he was at the time. I knew who Jeff Emmerich was. But yeah, similarly, me and Phil McDonald couldn't go to Trident. But of course, George, before all this, had done lots of records at Trident. He'd done Billy Preston, Doris Troy, the whole period before All Things Must Pass. He was so busy. He was making records as well as Beatles records, as well as Abbey Road record and everything. He was doing all his Doris Troy soul records, really. Doris Troy and Billy Preston. I was amazed, only just recently found out, of course, that he'd recorded All Things Must Pass and My Sweet Lord with Billy Preston. And he'd done those 2 songs.
So in bringing these tracks together, now you've left the music and then you hear the result of all this work. Was there anything after your hands were off of it and it's outside of the work that's going on in EMI? Is there anything about the decisions and the work that was done out on Trident that now, in retrospect, with your experience as a producer, that you think was the right decisions, the wrong decisions for the album? What's your sense of how they finished it off?
I think they finished it off really well. I thought the whole thing was really good. There were a few surprises hearing the strings and things. It wasn't that much different in terms of tonality and the mix to what I was used to hearing in the room. Because those 8 tracks, as you say, if you put those 8 tracks and just put the faders at 0, it would sound pretty much like the record, the finished thing. For instance, there's 2 drummers, 2 bass players, all on 1 track. All those acoustic guitars. Well, very often you'll do a stereo spread, like a stereo tracks 3 and 4 would be a spread of guitars. It would be the acoustic guitars, Eric on one side, George on the other. Then the keyboards, you might have the organ and the 2 pianos mixed together.
So at EMI, this is all being recorded through the TG console, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 console. Phil McDonald's doing a lot of work on the front end for tonality with EQ, compression.
Oh, yeah.
And then as you're explaining it, then this is getting summed down into these combinations and big combinations of elements as it's going to tape in order to get that huge band onto just 6 tracks of tape.
That's right.
Did you take any of that forward into your career as a producer? And how did you carry that forward into the work that you did later on?
Well, it's pretty quickly after this, of course, we got 16 track and 24 track. I don't know the years. Well, 16 track came in the year after, and then 24 track was probably 1976 or something. Now, of course, you've got infinite number of tracks, which is in a way horrible. I still record with a minimum number of tracks as possible. With Pro Tools now, of course, you can put 4 microphones on a guitar and record those 4 microphones and decide later. To me, that's not making records. That's not making a recording. You've got to present what the guitar is, what the musician is doing. You can't just leave it to the mixer because it might be you might be the mixer. And on the day of the mix, you're going to have so many decisions. You don't want to decide what microphone to use. That's got to be decided at the time,
It really sounds like you carried a lot forward from the Spector experience of we're figuring out not only the arrangement of the song, but our vision for it sonically, what we want it to be. And we're committing to that all along the way.
Yeah, that's kind of how I work, really. I mean, within certain, it may be 24 track, it may be 48 track. For instance, I did Radiohead The Bends, and again, I think if you put those tapes on and put the faders level, it would sound pretty much like the finished record, because that's how we recorded. And also a bit of fear and paranoia you learn from experience is very often people come in the room, the A&R man comes in, suddenly the record company phones up and says, hey, can we hear what you've been doing? Mm-hmm. So when you press that button and play it, it's got to sound great. You can't apologize and say, well, we've just got a rough drum take, or we've done the guitar, but we haven't decided what microphone to use yet. You can't make apologies because the A&R man, the manager, people that come in the room are going to want to hear as close to a finished record as possible. And you want them to go, wow, listen to that.
That's a super interesting point. I hadn't really considered it from that viewpoint because as a producer, whenever those inflection points come, I mean, your head's on the line. They could say like, yep, John, we thought you were the guy for the job, but hearing that, see you later.
Exactly. So you've got to be prepared as a producer, for me anyway, to knock people out that come into the room so they go away feeling really good and you're going to keep your job because it's great stuff. And it also makes the mix a lot easier as well, so you don't have so much pressure and decisions to make at the time.
Is that something, again, going forward in your career past the early period when now you're working with engineers and you're working with recording engineers that didn't grow up with that kind of discipline? Is that something that you are passing on to them, that decision making?
Yeah, I'd like them to think that way anyway. It's very different now with the computer because the other thing with the computer is people aren't looking at the room. They're not looking at people. They're looking at the screen. They're seeing the music go past on the screen rather than just listening on the speakers. We had the needles moving, used to watch the needles kicking, but it's different to watching the computer thing. Yeah. One other thing I should bring up actually is big speakers in the room. So one thing about Phil Spector is he monitored loud on big speakers. And that's another thing today. Everyone's got their near-field monitors and they all listen quiet on their little quirky sort of domestic speakers. Do your mix on the domestic speakers and it'll sound good at home. No. All those records, if you made a list of the 25, 50 greatest records of all time, they're all mixed on big speakers, loud.
I know EMI had moved on from the
Tannoys to JBLs.
They moved on from the Altex. So the Tannoys were still pretty massive speakers for monitors.
This was done on Tannoys, 15-inch, Tannoys.
Actually, a few years ago, a friend of mine had a 605A, an Altex 605A, which were what used to be in Abbey Road, for sale, and bought it. My brother's got it as like a mono stereo system. And you cannot overload that speaker. It is window-shatteringly loud if you choose to push it that way, but also crystal clear. Just a very unique combination. So Spector mixed loud. Did that pose any problems in just the overall tonality of the records, or?
I don't know. It felt good. That's the thing. Yeah, it felt good and it was impressive, I still do that when I go in the room, young engineers are like, are you deaf or something? It's not like I'm crazy. But, to me, you have to feel it as well as hear it,
That's a big difference, especially when you're talking about low frequency content, right? If it's not like hitting you, sometimes it doesn't feel like it's doing the job it's supposed to do. And you do only experience that if you've got enough sound pressure built up to actually carry across and give you a thump.
Yeah. And Phil Spector would also have the lights down low. And of course, the lighting in Abbey Road was terrible. It wasn't atmospheric at all. It was either fluorescent lights or crazy lights. So he'd always want the lights down low and the air conditioning on super cold.
Wow. That's interesting. To circle back to your point about people coming in that weren't part of the making of the record, that you had to make sure everything sounded good for. I know that there's just recently surfaced pictures of Alan Klein being around during the making of Plastic Ono Band. I don't know if that was at the tail end or not. Was he showing up, or Pete Bennett, who was the Apple Records promotion guy, were they showing up during the All Things Must Pass sessions as well?
I don't remember seeing Alan Klein or Pete Bennett. I remember them at John's sessions. But I don't remember, there was no outsiders really. I remember Donovan coming, and he was all in white, he had a white suit on and he looked fantastic, And Krishna people, I only remember once, maybe twice, Krishna devotees coming in with food. So they would come in the whole period, probably twice they came, just with a whole load of rice and vegetables and gave everyone rice and food and stuff. Other people, Patty Boyd, I remember coming once. Mal Evans, of course. Kevin was there all the time. I don't remember anyone else. I don't remember Terry or people. No, Neil, isn't it? Neil Aspinall.
Right.
He may have been there. I really don't know.
What we see in accounts that some people have described at this period of George launching a solo career on such a massive scale, and I think it's borne out in that memo that Spector wrote that I shared with you guys, is that he needed reassurance, that his confidence was a little shaky. And one can understand that, having labored under the shadow of Lennon and McCartney all those years, that he needed some bolstering. And it speaks to his surrounding himself with a bunch of people that were close friends to support him through this.
Yeah, that's right. That's what George was probably going through at that time, yeah.
Did you get a sense of
everyone did?
Of him not being completely sure of himself, and hence the 100 takes of things, that he needed to really feel confident about what he was doing? It took time to get there?
I can't really say. He didn't speak a lot. He didn't take control of the room, except when he was out in the studio showing musicians what to play and showing them chords and stuff. Mm-hmm. But he wasn't the most talkative person in the room when the playback happened, if you see what I mean.
I'm kind of curious about that dynamic between Spector and George as co-producers of the album. Was there a dividing line of the responsibility toward the work of production that you witnessed? Or was it, as you're just talking about, Harrison's getting the band together, but then leaves it up to Spector to be the kind of the taskmaster of now getting the best performance out of that? What was the dynamic between the two?
That's how it works. Exactly. Like you said, you got to remember George is playing, George can't really judge performance because he's one of the band. That's what the producer does. He ultimately trusted Phil Spector totally. I don't know if Phil Spector went to Trident Studios. I don't know if he was there. We did vocal overdubs. We did a lot of vocal overdubs when the track was finished. Sometimes George would come in first thing, 3 or 4 o'clock, and do vocals. A lot of slide guitar, his solos, My Sweet Lord solos and things, were overdubbed with George. In view of that letter from Phil, it's funny because when I read it, I thought, this is the kind of letter I would write as a producer. When you've got that far, when you've got your backing tracks and you're given a progress report, and it's always about the vocals. It's always about the vocals, and the vocals are never loud enough in the mix, because the rough mix, when you do a rough mix, you want to hear everything, because that's the purpose of the rough mix, is to hear what you've done. It's not to mix a hit single, it's to hear what everything's going on, and very often the vocal is buried a little bit in a rough mix, so that's probably why. But it was funny reading that, because even the language, the vague language, is what I would write if I was doing a record kind of thing. But I just wonder if Phil Spector was the Ken Scott Trident sessions.
It's interesting because there was a comment that George said years later, looking back at the All Things Must Pass sessions, where it was a bit of regret in using Phil, which he expressed as, I ended up doing more work working with Spector than I would have if I just produced it all myself all along.
Yeah, so maybe, maybe there were things that you didn't. People always say, oh, well, this is a hit record. Very often, if the record's not very good, they blame it on the producer. And if it's a great record, the producer never gets a mention.
Yeah, what producer?
We produced it, But if it's a big flop, they always blame it on the producer.
Which is interesting because it's still to this day, I think, is the biggest selling record from an ex-Beatle.
Yeah, and it is fantastic. I mean, I sat and played it last night all the way through, and it's fantastic. It's a special thing. And
so,
if it had been stripped down and the reverb had been taken off, it'll end up like that bloody Let It Be Naked record. It's horrible.
You couldn't have segued any better to a couple of questions that I had for you, which is the Harrison estate has been working on a naked version of All Things Must Pass, and I guess deverbing it. And they put out a preview of it, the All Things Must Pass song, as a preview of that. Have you heard that? And what is your opinion of it?
No, I haven't heard that. I didn't know. Is that available?
Sorry.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. Yes.
I've heard the All Things Must Pass that they re-recorded just in 2000, with George and Sam Brown. They did another,
My Sweet Lord,
All Things, My Sweet Lord, which is... Yeah. What could I say? It's beginners. It's actually beginners in the studio, really. I mean, the whole tonality of the thing, they need a producer.
My other question around what you discussed when you said you listened to the whole album being also sides 5 and 6.
Apple Jam.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Okay, that's interesting. I personally don't see in the context of the album how that is anything but an indulgence. But how do you view that?
The first thing is the Ginger Baker track, which is called Plug In Baby or something.
Plug Me In, yeah.
Plug Me In. The Ginger Baker track, never heard that before. With the noise, there's a synthesizer on it.
From Electronic Sound.
I never heard that at all. I don't know where that's come from. The other tracks I do remember, and the one in particular is called Out of the Blue, which is the longest one, which I'm sure was recorded with us. So those Apple Jam tracks were often done during a break. So me and Phil McDonald would go to the pub around the corner before the pub closed, 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and drink Guinness and have a sandwich because there was no food available there. I don't know what I can't remember any food coming in or anything.
And they're not going to feed you. You're the tape operator, right?
No, and they're not going to feed you. So I would put a reel of 1/4-inch tape, switch it to 7.5, which meant it would go on for an hour and 4 minutes, and set it in record, and whatever was coming out the speakers, and the band would just jam. As soon as they finished a take of a song, they would often go off into a jam, and Phil Spector would have to stop them and say, come on, let's go back to the song. Out of the Blue, I can remember being done when we were in the room, so we weren't in the pub, and they loved it so much they kept wanting to hear it. They kept wanting to play it. Play that jam again. Let's hear that jam again. Wow. And so they'd come in to hear a song they just done, and they go, no, man, play the jam. Let's hear that again.
It sounds almost like its inclusion in the album is almost a souvenir of the good time that they had making the recording. I can get it from that.
The other thing, when I listened to it last night, of course, Out of the Blue's got Ringo on it. You can tell it's Ringo playing drums.
Yeah, just a little back in the beat and
the Tom Phil,
Yeah. He's such a distinctive player. It truly, just as a fan listening to that album, puzzled me, the context of 5 and 6 against the rest of the album. As a double album, it's absolutely one of the greatest double albums ever recorded. I get to side 5 and 6, and I'm like, I'm not sure.
I know.
Yeah. if there's going to be comments on this, I can just see the comments now flying at me.
Yeah,
But,
like side 2 of Live Peace in Toronto for you, is it?
Yeah. But it could only have been George's decision. And I don't think he had to argue his point. I'm sure that they said, yeah, sure, do it. Put everything out, everything that was recorded in that. Even It's Johnny's Birthday, for God's sake. I was shocked when I heard that was on the record, because that was just a joke one time for John Lennon's birthday, and it's a song called Congratulations, da 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 da, and we got it from the tape library. I can't remember how it happened, but I'm singing on it, and then everyone went out and sang It's Johnny's Birthday. Everyone's there singing. I can hear my voice anyway, so we all sang it, and then played with the vary speed as we're singing, where someone's turning the vary speed. Psychedelic it was. It was great, and I was shocked that got put on there.
And you were there when they presented it to John during the Plastic Ono band sessions. October 9th, his birthday, was the day that they recorded Remember. And if you go on YouTube, there's like a 20-minute session reel of that when George comes in and John greets him.
Oh, yeah?
Uh-huh.
I'd have to hear that. Yeah, I wasn't there when Remember was recorded.
Oh, okay.
I was. No, sorry, I was, but I don't remember George coming. I really can't remember. I remember.
Maybe at the pub.
No, I remember when John did Remember, because Remember the 5th of November.
Yes.
And I knew he was going to do it because it's an English thing. It's a British thing, the 5th of November. Uh-huh. And, he was doing a few times. I thought, Remember the 5th of November. And then suddenly he sang it, So I thought this is crazy. Yeah.
I think you mentioned that you were struck by his playing the piano with 2 fingers or something, that it was such a simple piece of music.
That's right. Yeah. It's very simple to play. You just move up one note, don't you? And dun, 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 dun.
Departing a little bit from All Things Must Pass, in your early years working, you worked with Paul, you worked with John, you worked with George, you experienced them in the studio. I mean, what were the differences in your experience of them as musicians in the studio?
I didn't work with them all together, of course.
No, on different projects. Yeah. You worked on one of my favorite early Wings tracks, High, 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 which just such a great rocker.
Take 26 or something. Yeah.
Well, you could tell me about that. And then Plastic Ono Band, and of course, All Things Must Pass. As you're experiencing now these Beatles and their post-Beatle life, and you're experiencing them in the studios, I mean, what was your impression of working with them and kind of the differences in their whatever temperament, working approach? They were quite different times and things. I mean, as I say, George was fairly quiet. He wasn't like Paul. Paul would take control of the situation, would take command. He'd come in and he'd go, okay, let's listen to the drums, so he'd solo the drums and he'd suggest things, or he'd get the drummer to play, and he'd be there on the mixer with me, totally in control, producing the record, really, and totally in control of what was going on, and frustrated when it wasn't happening, and those kind of things, yeah.
Did you get a sense that he knew what he was going for and it was just a matter of capturing it? Or was it more sort of an exploration? Let's try this. No, let's try this.
No, he gave the impression he knew what he was going for.
Okay.
It wasn't experimental. It wasn't an improvised thing,
The vision was already baked, and he was just trying to get people to realize that.
Exactly. From the musicians, Henry McCulloch and those kind of things. And he would get frustrated when it wasn't happening. But he was in command of the studio at the time.
Was it another situation with McCartney, as you've described, with Harrison working, where there was rehearsal to build up the song and now we're going to print it, now we're going to record it, or did they come in ready to do it, or was this like they're building it from scratch?
They're building it from scratch, really. And so things were changing all the time in arrangements and tempo and drum fills and things. I mean, all I'm talking about is that song High, High, High. And I also did on Red Rose Speedway the medley section, Lazy Dynamite and that kind of, which isn't very good. And it was really frustrating because a lot of time there's not drums and there's not much happening other than Paul singing and playing. And again, you've got no click. So it's all down to Paul creating the part, the vibe and the tempo and everything on Lazy Dynamite and whatever else it goes into and the medley, and trying to record the whole thing in one go. Maybe I was suggesting we could do it in sections. I think we did. I think I spent 2 weeks or 14 days doing that. And then John and Yoko, of course, John had Yoko, and he was very much engrossed. They were a couple, they were together. But John was much more, again, he wouldn't sit at the mixer. You see, Paul would sit at the mixer and turn the knobs, or he'd tell you to turn the knob, bit more, oh, too much kind of thing. Whereas John wouldn't do that, he'd just say, well, that doesn't sound very good, let's do it again, I don't think he would blame the sound. He would very often just say, do it again, hoping that next time it's going to sound better. So those things would happen, and if he got excited about something, that would be it. It'd be move on. It was working a lot quicker, I think, than what my experience of Paul was going on,
And we've heard that Lennon was famously impatient in the studio, just to get on with it, get it done, get a track done, and move on to the next work. Did you sense that from him? Was it impatience, period, or impatience toward a finished result he was looking for?
It wasn't impatience, let's see. It wasn't frustration. It was knowing that what we had wasn't quite right, and wanting to try again. When he got there, even though it was ragged or something, or even though there was an obvious mistake, he would go for it. That was the one,
Last time we talked, you referenced that little glitch at the beginning of Hold On when you were late on the start button. And that made the record because apparently everything else was right.
That's right. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Whereas that wouldn't be Paul's approach.
No, Paul would just do another take, or I'd be fired. I'd be out, if I didn't press the button quick enough.
Did you feel a different sense of pressure depending on who you're working with? Was the pressure working under Spector different than working on Paul's sessions than working on the sessions with John? For you personally, what was that?
It was more scary working with Paul, let's say, even as a tape op. You never knew if he was your friend or if he was going to fire you. You never knew if he was like your best mate or if he was going to tell you to get out or something. So maybe it was just the time. I'm sure he's a lovely man.
All right. But you didn't feel that same sensation working with John. And a lot of people going through life describing Lennon as scary and acid-tongued and all that stuff. You weren't feeling that.
No. But maybe that was at the time. No, I didn't feel that at all. Maybe that was the time after Primal Therapy or with Yoko and doing his thing. And who else was in the room? His best mates, Klaus and Ringo. Klaus is a real calming influence, reliable, and he's good.
Yeah, I met him once, and he's a very chill individual, very quiet and relaxed and unassuming and massively talented.
Right. Did you have much direct interaction with Billy Preston?
Not really, no. He came in and danced around. Everyone loved him. I don't remember him playing that much organ, but I'm sure he did. There was a lot of people in the room.
He's on the one track on Plastic Ono Band as well, on God.
Oh, yeah. That's right. He plays second piano. I think that's an overdub, though. I don't know if they played it together. I'm not quite certain.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think we knew that.
Let's see. Other people, I looked on the internet, people like Peter Frampton, I don't remember him at all.
Right. Bill Collins on congas.
Yeah, that one's interesting. I have a
Bill Collins on congas.
I have a vague recollection.
I love that.
Because in Studio 2, so most of the sessions for All Things Must Pass were in Studio 3, which is still a big studio, but a smaller studio. And of course, Studio 2 is the big cavernous room, and you look down and you have to run up and down the stairs. And I can remember we did Waiting on You All and Art of Dying in Studio 2, which were big tracks with everyone playing and, kind of wild and always up and down the stairs, different things happening. Again, lots of people hanging around in Studio 2 because you could kind of sit in the corner and lose yourself. Mm-hmm. If you're in Studio 3, you'd be seen, whereas Studio 2, you could just be in the corner there and no one know you're there kind of thing. Maybe Phil Collins, yes. I have a vague recollection of running around looking for a conga mic. There was always something there. And from what I understand is Phil Spector,
just have to describe the whole experience of all these.
But Phil, I can remember going out, on the Wurlitzer piano, and Phil McDonald said, "Oh, go and check that Wurlitzer, it's buzzing or something." So I'd go out there and fiddle around and play some notes, and Phil would be standing there and go, "Hey man, you play piano? Do you want to play on this track?" And I'm like, no, I can't play piano. So, he was very often, apparently, from what I read about Phil, at Gold Star and doing all those things with Hal Blaine, if friends turned up to the session, he'd say to Hal Blaine, "Hey Hal, you got a tambourine? Give this guy a tambourine to bang," or something. So Phil was always wanted more people to be part of it. It created the vibe. But I remember him saying to me when I was testing out this Wurlitzer, he said, "Hey, you want to play on this track?" And I always remember going back in the room thinking, God, I could have played that, on this record, So yeah, Phil Spector.
Phil wasn't allowed to touch anything, right? Only the tape op could, is that right?
No, Phil Spector. Phil Spector would never touch the mixing desk, no. No one touched
or make any adjustments or anything.
No, he'd never do anything like that. No.
Well, you still have the amp room boys, right, that were responsible for routing signals to the Siemens system, for mic setup, for any of that. If a wire needed to be plugged, the brown coats that's their domain, right?
Yeah.
And then they didn't cross your domain. They're not in the control room.
No. If anything went wrong, if headphones or microphone went, you would phone up the amp room and they would come and fix it. You didn't have to mess around or anything. As a tape op, your only duty was to run tape. No one touched that tape except you, and no one pressed stop. If someone said stop, and you were talking or something, you would be the only one pressing the button.
And I understand for some of the work that was done through the balance engineer that the amp room was also involved. I had a talk with Ken Townsend, and he was telling me that when they would request some tweaking on the EQs that weren't available in the console, and they had to go out to the amp room where they had an RS-56, had the curve bender, that they would call them and say, dial this in on this insert for us. Is that?
Yeah.
That seems like such a crazy process to me, but.
Kind of, yeah, maybe. There wasn't a lot of inserts or outboard gear really at all. It was all done on the mixer. There was certainly no external EQ boxes. It was really just TG mixer, Fairchild limiters, and Altec compressors. That was it. There was no only, yeah, and that's all. And you want 4 or 5 Fairchilds, wheel them in. You want 6 compressor Altecs, wheel them in. You want 4 tape echo machines, wheel them in.
And then you had the Zener diode compressor limiters built into the board.
That's correct. Yeah, they were horrible though. They were meant to simulate a Fairchild, but they didn't really. You kind of avoided them, really.
Oh, interesting. So you noticed that they were going out to the Fairchilds more. They were going out to the Altec more to do that work. Something that the board didn't do well, despite their best efforts.
That's right. Yeah. Fairchild and Altec. How much is a Fairchild now? It's $20,000 or something.
if you could find one that works.
Is there any particular stories we haven't talked about yet that stand out as memorable with George, with John, with Paul? You said you did a little bit of work on the Sentimental Journey album. I don't know if you worked directly with Ringo for that or George Martin, who was overseeing that. Anything we haven't covered?
Sentimental Journey is a very vague memory. I mean, it was just like a morning session with George Martin probably overdubbing strings. And I think Ringo was there, Mm-hmm. Ringo, of course, was great as well. He had an assistant. He was at the time doing Magic Christian, I think, the film.
Right.
And he had an assistant called Martin, I think, who'd come around and empty the ashtrays. And I didn't know who this guy was, but he was the same age as me. When you're 20 and everyone else in the room is 26, you cotton on to people. So, yeah, I remember Ringo was good vibes, just like happy and good vibes. And they were all really good.
Was that like your only experience with George Martin, or did you work with him on anything else?
Not really, no. I did a thing called Flanders and Swan. You may not know what the Flanders and Swan is. Flanders and Swan is very English kind of.
Sounds British.
Theatre. It is, yeah. Check out Flanders and Swan, yeah.
Okay.
It's not rock and roll. I don't know if anyone has ever confirmed it, but wah-wah, do you know what wah-wah means? You've given me a wah-wah, a headache.
Right.
It's an Indian Hindu term for a headache. Oh, wah-wah,
I didn't know that.
You give me a wah-wah. Yeah, it's a Hindu term for a headache, and maybe that's where George got it from.
Well, I didn't know the Indian connection. I read a quote where he described it as meaning a headache, but he left out the Indian part. I don't know if you know the circumstances. He wrote that song right after he walked out of the Twickenham sessions on January 10th, 1969.
There you go.
With the intent of quitting the Beatles, and that's where that song came from.
Ah, yeah. You're giving me a wah-wah, you see?
Yeah, and I always thought it was very interesting. The very first song he performed in public outside the Beatles was at the concert for Bangladesh. It was Wah Wah.
Ah, yeah. And that was recorded, we can just say, on the first day, because I spoke to someone who's writing the book about just this, really.
Yes.
And I always remember we spent from 4 p.m. till 6 a.m. doing My Sweet Lord. And then when we finished, I don't know who it was, but someone said, hey, let's do another song. And they went straight out there after My Sweet Lord, this is true, and did Wah Wah on the same day.
Did they know it meant headache?
Probably, yeah. And I don't know how many takes they did of Wah Wah. There wasn't many, but there was reverb. And again, if you got the 8 tracks and just put the faders up, that's what it would sound like, as Wah Wah with the full-on thing. And,
right, horns and everything.
Yeah, yeah. And it's quite lengthy as well, The other thing about some of these tracks that occurred to me last night when I'm sitting there looking at things, there's no 3-minute singles. There's no 3-minute hit singles on that. Some even Isn't It a Pity is like 7 minutes long, isn't it?
Did you feel that was indulgent? I mean, again, in retrospect, and as a producer now, do you feel that those songs could have used some editing, some tightening? Or
yeah, if I was doing it now, I would be aware of that and thinking we're going to need a radio edit on this. I don't think there was any radio edits on this album. Did anyone radio edit a Beatles track? I don't think so.
No, Wings tracks, though.
Yeah, Wings.
Edited.
Maybe it's because FM radio at that time would play full tracks. They weren't so
anything they could get their hands on.
Yeah, I too of electronic sound.
Yeah, but no, that's a big thing now. Of course, is the 3-minute. Even today in streaming, I think so. Maybe I'm out of it anyway. But it's a big thing to have that radio edit. That 3.5-minute deadline where you don't want it any longer.
I can't imagine the last single that was ever over 4 minutes or something. I don't think that's even been a thing, right? That epic
right.
single. Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, I couldn't imagine editing down My Sweet Lord. I could maybe imagine editing Isn't It a Pity, but My Sweet Lord's kind of perfect, isn't it?
Yeah. The other thing, it's probably got nothing to do with this, is Lon and Derek Van Eaton.
Oh,
I don't know if you know
Sweet
on
music.
Apple.
Yeah.
Sweet Music, which is just, you ever heard that, Luther?
I have. Yeah. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like them.
Mm-hmm. I worked on that, after all this and months
That's
after.
a great single.
Yeah.
And it's got Ringo on it and everything. I don't remember recording the track. Maybe we were certainly, but I can remember doing weeks of sessions with those guys, me and Phil McDonald and these 2 young guys producing. And of course, they weren't really producers. George wasn't there, I'm sure.
No, Klaus, I think, produced the bulk of the album other than
Klaus,
Sweet Music.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was Klaus, yeah.
Yeah. I've had Lon on the show before. He's great.
Yeah?
Yeah, he's awesome.
But I can remember after this, spending a good few weeks in the studio doing their record.
Yep.
It sounds like Phil McDonald was a real critical relationship for you and in your growth toward engineering and producing. I mean, would you want to comment maybe a little on his influence on you?
He was wonderful. He was one of these engineers that kind of got a magic special sound, and you don't know how he did it. It was at the TG Mixer. If Phil was the engineer, it would just sound quality. Whereas being a tape op, you would work with different people and they would all have their own sound. Very often how they look, actually. What I always think engineers, if the guy's got long hair and a beard, then that's the kind of sound you get. If the guy's really smart and formal,
remember
that's
Luther.
the kind of sound you get.
I don't know if you want that. So what did Phil look like back then? Was he straight-laced? Was he very...
Phil's from Yorkshire. He's quite soft-spoken, but, he's quite an authority. He had kind of curly hair and was just devoted to Beatles, really. I mean, he was devoted to them, and he went off and worked at Apple and did Harry Nilsson, and was at Friar Park and things. I saw him 20 years ago. I don't know where he is or what he's doing. He's living in America somewhere,
He worked on Abbey Road, right? You or Jerry would know. Did he work on any Beatles stuff before Abbey Road?
He engineered a number of Beatles sessions throughout the years.
He did.
He did. He was one of the primary engineers there at EMI. Worked on a lot of sessions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, worked on a lot of sessions.
And he's one that John yells at during the Imagine sessions for.
That Phil. Phil. Yeah.
Right.
Phil McDonald, yeah.
Not Lennon's finest moment.
No.
Flashing from Lennon in that.
Misplaced anger, I think.
Yeah. But no, Phil was great. And the other engineers there was Peter Bown, as I say, who I worked with. And Peter was a bit older. And he did Beatles sessions as well after, Norman. So he mixed Let It Be with Phil Spector and did loads. And he did Pink Floyd, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, all the psychedelic stuff.
Cool.
And he also recorded operas. I think he started like 1950, Peter Bown, and as well as doing the Floyd and Tomorrow and all the crazy stuff, probably the Shadows and things and Cliff Richard. But he also recorded operas. And I can remember in the mid-70s, they were short of classical engineers at Abbey Road because various people had left, and they had to get Peter Bown in to record an opera. And by an opera, I'm talking a full-on symphony orchestra with a 100-piece choir and all the soloists. And he'd record it on 4-track. It'd be on 4-track. So 2 tracks of orchestra, 2 tracks of choir and singers. And that would
absolutely
be 4-track. And if you want a bit more vocal, you just turn the choir up a bit,
The skills to do that, to balance that's some crazy engineering skills.
Yeah, well, that's the same with what we said about Phil Spector of recording. It's the same mentality of you're recording a group of musicians. Doesn't matter if it's a 90-piece symphony orchestra or 4 Beatles. You're capturing that moment with them, And the best way to capture, like taking a photograph, you don't take 16 photographs and edit them together. You take one photograph, you get the lighting right and the camera, you're in focus and you take that photograph, That's how I kind of like to think I work, really, is you take the photograph and then maybe you touch it up a bit, you put it in Photoshop and just...
Well, you'll go insane otherwise, You have to think that way in a way with that many pieces, right?
Yeah. But even with a 4-piece band or, even with a folk singer, a guitar and voice, you're still capturing it with the room and that kind of thing.
Was that a filter for you when you were being approached, especially your post-Radiohead success, where everyone's coming to you? We want that magic too. Was that a filter for you in terms of like who you might want to work with, knowing that the band could play together as opposed to 4 or 5 good musicians, but a band that could really perform together?
Yeah. Because then your job's easier, You go and I'm lazy, and if you've got a band that can play together, that make a sound, you go and see them in some club or something and it sounds fantastic. It's going to be easy to get them in the studio. Whereas if it's a shambles and the drummer's on cymbals all over the place and, the singer's out of tune, you don't really want to take the job on.
It reminds me of something. Tom Murray, the photographer, was one of the guys on Mad Day Out. And when I had him on the show, he said that once he figured out capture what the camera is seeing, your job is halfway done. And it's like we were describing here. It's like once you can hear what is getting onto tape, knowing what's doing, shape things until you're hearing what the recorder's hearing, then your job is mostly done.
That's right. Yeah. And it doesn't mean you have to use one microphone. It's not, you don't have to be so pure as to use one microphone. You can use 50 microphones, but you want to take that one photograph. And again, like I say, if the A&R man comes in or the manager and whoever's paying for the session, he wants to hear it as good as finish. You can't apologize and sort of say, well, we haven't sampled the drums yet or something.
We'll fix it in the mix.
No.
It's harder to find band chemistry these days, obviously, but have you been noticing the decline of that over the years? That's something you've been noticing, that you could go to a club and just be, wow, look at the chemistry that band has on stage. And I could record that just by the way that music is made these days and stuff. You just don't really get to. And now, of course, we're in a time where no one's playing, but even pre that. It's difficult, right?
Yeah. And also people in the band all want to do other things. They all want to be producers or engineers. The bass player doesn't want to just
Why
play
is
the
that?
bass. There's so much else going on besides just playing in the band,
Yep.
They seem they've got to learn Pro Tools and these kind of things. If you're a musician, you don't really have to learn Pro Tools. The Beatles didn't learn Pro Tools, did they?
They managed.
They did fine.
Yeah, it did all right by themselves. I would ask a final question, John, from this period of your work, is there anything that people never ask you about the sessions or about the work or your experience that you'd want to share? Like a question that never comes up and you're off these calls and you're like, boy, no one ever talks about X.
X, I thought you said sex. Sex and drugs and rock and roll, isn't it? Yeah, those three.
No, the band X. The band X.
The band X. No, I can't think of anything like that. Let me see. No.
Well, you're asked so many questions, right?
I know.
I think we finally got every question out that nobody asked him.
How do you find time to eat, or how do you find time to sleep? As I say, we used to run around the pub and have a sandwich and a pint of Guinness. And
thank God for the Krishnas.
Yeah, and the Krishnas, yeah. So those kind of things in that time, we didn't have pizza even in England, at that time. So, yeah, eating and sleeping. All those late nights. People don't work in that. Well, Luther does, but people don't work late in the studio anymore. I was saying about big speakers. I was saying all these records are done loud on big speakers, and also most people, finish work at, they start at 9 a.m. playing rock and roll at 9 a.m. And they're all finished by 6.
That's just wrong. It's
all wrong. Yeah. Rock and roll for me is 2 till 2, really. That's the time,
It's hard for you to find young bands who'll even stay up that late.
I know, it's crazy. Wimps.
Total wimp. I would ask you one last question, and maybe you guys covered it, but, obviously with George's spiritualism and everything, and when you went in to do this album, All Things Must Pass, and, it's a pretty epic session, and it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of sessions. Did you feel that permeate the session? I mean, were you made aware, did George make everybody aware of that spirituality, or did he kind of just leave it out of the session and not impose on him? But I would imagine that would have been pleasing and would have been kind of a nice thing. And
yeah, you could, as I say, you could often find George sitting at the back chanting Hare Krishna. He had a little bead bag around his neck, so he'd be counting his beads like a rosary or something, but it's a mala beads, and be chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. So you could hear him doing that in the background. No one joined in. No, he didn't invite everyone to pray with him or anything.
Not
like
Phil,
that,
Spectre.
No.
So just in a gentle way, he just had his own way of being spiritual during that, and you could sense that, but it wasn't made a big deal.
He didn't proselytize.
No. But it was interesting, of course. The Phil Spector letter. Phil Spector.
Oh my God, I've seen that. That is incredible.
At the end, Phil Spector says Hare Krishna. He says
very diplomatic.
Yeah, yours sincerely, Phil Spector, Hare Krishna.
Amazing.
Got to know who you're working for. It's one of the
well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, one of the critical
end of the day.
Yeah. It's how you remain employed as a producer. Remember who you're working for.
Wouldn't have worked on John.
Yeah, probably not.
Right. I don't believe.
I'd hate to think what drugs you were forced to partake in the 90s just to stay in the good graces of bands like the Stone Roses and all the Britpop and everything.
There you go. Yeah.
Edit.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.